Hello, hello, and welcome to Imagine an Apple podcast with me as your host, Vynn and Francis.
Hello there.
Today on our show, we have Jane, also known as Janus Flowers on her Twitter handle, here to talk to us about imagining apples, horses, and various other visual based stimuli. Um, Hi, Jane.
Hello.
So tell us more about yourself because I saw you wrote a little thread under our mutual friend's Twitter account talking about your ability to imagine things with your mind's eye. But it seems like, unlike normal people, you seem to have more of a refined ability with this practice, especially with Kasina. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got into this and what is different about your ability?
Yeah, so I guess, I've always had, I'm a visual designer by trade. I'm a fashion designer. I used to be user experience designer. So I've always been a visual kind of person. But I've never had the ability to, close my eyes and literally see what's there. I do like what everyone else kind of does. I can do the mind's eye kind of thing.
Hmm.
But recently I did, kind of over the summer, I had a lot of experiences with meditation that kind of slowly started to, I'd have my eyes closed and everything like usual. And stuff would kind of start to coalesce. It would kind of, you'd start to see, it's kind of like almost kind of looking at an optical illusion. And then like all of a sudden you see something just kind of pop into place. Like if you're looking at, if you've ever seen that kind of, there's this kind of mask illusion that's this
Right.
animated mask that I think Slate Star Codex did a post on at one point. And you can kind of see it, and it rotates. And the thing is, like half of people see it when it's popped out, it's kind of this like 3D statue thing, and half of them see it as if it's like concave, so it's convex or concave depending on how you're looking at it.
Right. Yeah, I'm
Um,
familiar with that. Do you know what it's called? Because I don't really have a word that I can
I
place
just
to it.
heard the mask illusion. I have no idea
A
exactly
mask.
what it's called. It may have a particular name. I have no idea exactly what the thing
Okay,
is.
well,
But
we'll call it the mask
yes,
illusion for now.
yeah, and
Interesting.
I can
So,
I can send out the link to the post. I have it somewhere.
thanks. Yeah, we'll
But yeah,
we'll
so
put on
if
the
you
show
look at
notes a
it,
little bit. So,
if you look at
meditation you
it,
mentioned. I just wanted to know to ask you like what sort of meditation practice this was because I know that there's all these different kinds going about.
mhm.
Was it a particular meditative practice that you did, or?
Not really, no.
Okay.
I have a weird experience with meditation in terms of I seem to have a lot of access to a lot of, in terms of at least going by kind of like the standard, I guess, kind of Buddhist practice of the jhanas and everything like that. I never had to really practice for the jhanas; they kind of came to me. I was doing a breathwork course one time, and I kind of, I'd never done that sort of thing before. So I just kind of sat down, and did, followed the instructor and everything. It was a class. And then all of a sudden, after like 10 minutes or something, I like entered this weird altered state. And only because I'm on Twitter and see tweets by people who do meditation. Seriously, I'm like, I know what state I'm in. This is a jhana. And so I
Right.
ended up going through jhana 1, and then very quickly after that, jhana 5, which is when your whole body dissolves, and it kind of feels like you just kind of leap over the Grand Canyon and keep falling and falling and falling.
Hmm.
And so that just kind of came out of nowhere. So I kind of have been playing around with that all summer. And so playing around with that experience, after having this kind of like being thrown into the deep end, is when I started to play around and started to notice these kind of visualizations. And I kind of started to I kind of gravitated towards them,
Hmm.
just because they were very interesting. And I've also had a lot of visual snow, which is if you have your eyes open, you generally see kind of a lot of almost kind of a static sort of thing. It's usually a little more colorful than like a black and white TV static. And it's very slight. I know some people who seem to have it much stronger than I do. But I've always been fascinated by that kind of visual phenomenon as well.
Hmm.
And I've always tried to kind of like shape it, if that makes sense. And I was never really able to kind of do it. But with my eyes closed for whatever reason, when I was getting into this kind of genre territory, there seemed to be some kind of way that there's some kind of order kind of coalesced, and it didn't happen all at once. It was probably probably about a month or so of kind of doing it every couple of days for a couple hours each, I started to kind of slowly be able to kind of see. First, it was kind of going from 2D to 3D, and it was basically just kind of blobs at that point. It wasn't anything fancy, or it wasn't like any images or symbols or anything like that.
Wait,
But
so what's going from 2D to 3D?
basically, kind of like what I was saying with the kind of optical illusion of the mask. It's like you can kind of it kind of just
Oh,
pops into
okay.
place all of a sudden. It's kind of like you're kind of like walking by something, and then it's the perspective kind of pops out into place.
Right.
I
This
guess
is
it's kind of
applied
like
to the,
almost, yeah,
yeah.
it's like you're looking at a painting, and it's like for whatever reason the leading point or whatever. And my knowing what I do now about having read a lot about a lot of papers about like visual reification and how the brain's processing works in that regard. It has to do with how the brain manufactures shadows.
Okay.
And because what is a shadow? It's basically information you don't have. And so for whatever reason, that part of the visual imagery, or at least this is my kind of like harebrained theory. For whatever reason, is if you keep paying attention long enough to the noise or the static or whatever you see when you have your eyes closed,
Hmm.
you can start to run that kind of machinery, that kind of reification. The brain wants to see things in the noise. It wants to see signal in the static. So it will start to eventually, once it can pinpoint enough things it can latch onto, it will say, ah, there is a shadow. That is a 3D like space. And so it kind of looks like, again, very early on, it's literally just like blobs, and you have to be very, and they're almost, in my case, they were very monochromatic, so it was very difficult to see at first.
Hmm.
So it took a lot of patience. But slowly, things you would start to kind of get a handle, and it's kind of felt like early, like 80s or 90s CGI kind of stuff.
Right.
Like those kind of like gray landscapes and things like that. Just very basic, very blobby still.
Hmm.
And knowing some stuff about computer vision from having done all of that, and knowing some stuff about like ray tracing and things, was very
Hmm.
fascinating to kind of be building this process from the ground up with my own brain. But
Interesting.
one thing led to another, and eventually, like just doing that kind of practice. And then you start to see things that actually look like things. Like in my case, I ended up seeing a lot of usually my kind of first sign that I was like actually in the kind of space where I could actually start to see images was plants for whatever reason. It'd be trees, like thickets. My interpretation of that is that that's a very good surface symmetry wise
Hmm.
because there's a lot of leaves and things. So it's very symmetrical, but it's also very deep and detailed.
So where do you
So
imagine these trees and plants? Is it like with your eyes closed, or do you keep your eyes open and then just project it into the world?
they are right now. It's closed. Sometimes if it's in a dark room, and I've been doing this meditation for a little while, I can keep my eyes open, and I can kind of see it. It's almost kind of like a split screen, almost. I can't
Wow.
imagine it quite yet on my like visual field, like
Hmm.
in the room with me. I've heard that that's possible,
Hmm.
and maybe I'll try that one day. But yeah.
Do you think it gets so from what it sounds like, pre-meditation you weren't able to do this, and then after meditation, you suddenly were practicing this for a while before you got the ability to then have these um, visual, I don't know what to call them, hallucinations, I suppose, or like visual practice.
Yeah, visual. I mean, yeah, I guess the technical term in meditation I learned after this. So I guess I invented this kind of meditation independently. Is called Kasina practice.
Casino. Okay.
Like I
Tell me
mentioned in
more
my
about
Twitter thread. But yeah, so that's I've just heard them referred to as the Kasina visualizations. There's not really a name for the particular visualizations, at least that I'm aware of.
that. Right. So it sounds like this is a very recent ability that you've picked up as well, because you mentioned like you were playing with this last summer. Uh, how long ago did you gain this capacity?
Probably like a month ago or so.
A month
Uh,
ago. Wow.
it has
Okay.
not been all that long.
And has it been aided beyond just like the meditative practice? Is there like more training that you had to do, or some kind of like altered state of mind that you have to enter before you're able to start visualizing in the way that you're describing?
Not really. No, it takes. It sometimes takes a while. And again, I kind of have to build it up from scratch each
Right.
time. It's not like I can go into it immediately and
Hmm.
immediately be able to control what I want to see and immediately see everything super rich. It usually takes a couple minutes at least
Right.
to get to the phase where I can even see, my tiny little like a leaf on a plant or something like that. Which again, I have
It,
no idea why that's the like kind of starting gun for me. That's kind of in the Buddhist terminology. There's this the term for like how you know you're in a particular jhana is you look for their word for a sign is called a nimitta. I think I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. But anyway, so I guess my nimitta is like a tree or something like that, which is weird, and I have no idea if that's like again, for whatever reason, it feels like maybe if it's going off of visual reification and shadows and symmetry, plants seem like a good enough kind of substrate for that. Otherwise, maybe it's just, I mean, my last name is Flowers. So maybe it's a psychological thing that's personal to me. I have no idea. But yeah, it's only been about a month or so, and the only thing I've tried it with, other than meditation, is ketamine because it seems to be very tied to muscle relaxation.
Mm-hmm.
Whenever I'm in the kind of state where I can control them, I notice a whole lot, whether I'm sober or I have tried ketamine with it, there's a very intense kind of muscle relaxation. And so ketamine is a muscle relaxant.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of its main properties. So playing around with that has helped. It speeds it up at least. So if I'm ever like really tired and I really don't want to do the discipline that takes, it usually takes at least 30 minutes to get to full power by myself, sometimes longer, depending on the day,
Mm-hmm.
depending
Can
on
you
if I've
talk us through
eaten.
that process of you getting charged up,
Yeah,
essentially?
I mean, it really kind of depends. But like I said, I kind of just, I usually, when I meditate, I usually lay down.
Mm-hmm.
That's another thing that I found really helps, is that, again, it seems to be very, despite this being a visualization, despite this seeming like it would be a very kind of heady, like visual kind of process, it is very tied to the body somehow. I'll go into later because it seems to be very tied to both jhanas 4 and a little bit of jhana 5, just in terms of the body experience. But all that to say, I usually lay down, just totally flat, because it helps to feel. You can feel when you're releasing tension. You can feel when the body needs to release tension somewhere, and that generally helps speed up the process a whole lot. So it's not just kind of this like disembodied mental like thinking phenomenon, which is interesting as well. So I'll lay down. I'll put on a mask usually. It depends. The funny thing is, like the more I treat it like a ritual, the faster it comes. So sometimes I'll light some incense or something like that. Sometimes I'll like plan my whole day around it in the sense that I'm like I'll fast the entire day. But sometimes I won't. It really kind of depends. Although fasting does seem to help make it much more intense. And then I'll just kind of lay there. And it usually takes. Usually I do it in silence. Sometimes music is fun. But usually I've found that in the beginning it's a little too distracting to have music and to focus on kind of building up the visuals. But once you get going, and the times I have kind of pushed through that, having music is fantastic to go with these things. They don't really mesh together in terms of like it's not like I'm like seeing a music video for the music, but they, for whatever reason, the kind of sensations complement each other. Even if it's not in a literal symbolic sense, it's just kind of nice to have kind of like a guided kind of music path to kind of go on instead of just kind of doing it in total silence.
Right.
But again, that also makes it very difficult in the early stages to focus on just the visualization. So it's kind of a balance.
Mm-hmm.
But again, yeah, usually I just kind of stare into the noise on the back of my eyelids, until usually it doesn't take me long at all to at least kind of see some 3D blobs or visualizations or something.
Right.
And then past a certain point, there's a kind of weird phase after like a minute or two when you're in it a bit more.
Mm-hmm.
When it seems like your visual field when your eyes are closed, it seems like it widens by 30 or 40%. And so whatever your peripheral vision is like increases by a lot. And so it kind of feels like you get much more deeper in it all of a sudden. It's kind of like, I guess that would be similar to access concentration, is kind of what I'd call it. But once you're in there, that's when you feel like you're kind of in that world, for lack of a better term, versus just kind of watching it from a looking glass. So for whatever reason, that step is crucial. I don't know how to describe it other than that. It also usually gets slightly darker. Like even if I'm in a room that's pretty light, my vision will get very dark. And usually, especially at this phase, usually the only colors I'm seeing are shades of from complete black, all the way up to like a dark kind of royal blue.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, I just kind of watch it and just try. Sometimes I'll concentrate and try to actually build up something symbolic, like either a plant or like a statue or something like that.
What's the most
Otherwise,
complex
I'll
thing that you
just.
can imagine?
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What's the most complex or complicated thing that you can imagine visually?
I mean, it's interesting because it's like what you think is complex is not quite as complex as because you would think that, oh, it's really difficult to imagine for example, one thing I do a lot is like detailed like rooms or palaces or decor or things like that. For whatever reason, I have like this weird kind of like British royal country vibe,
Right.
and so
And you
it's
were able
interesting.
to do this before?
No, well, I mean, in my mind's eye, yes, but not in like visual, like as in like feeling like I'm walking through a simulation of all of them, like I do. No, I was not able to do that. Although I do have at least some background in interior design as well, so maybe that contributes to it in some regard. But that was not it was not interior designing with my internal Kasina visualizations back then.
Right.
But
Incredible.
yeah, so probably the most complex thing is one of my favorite things to do is kind of go into these like very kind of ornate houses, rooms, or whatever, and then kind of walk around in all the details, or kind of I don't say walk because I don't really have a sense of a body when I'm doing this.
Hmm.
That has
Hmm.
been something I've been working on.
Right. So do you think there's a difference between, I guess, walking through what you simulate versus walking in your mind's eye?
I mean, I really mind's eye is different, and I've been really thinking about mind's eye
Can you
recently,
speak about
just
the difference?
because in contrast to this, because you
Yeah.
never think about you hear about some people who can visualize things for real like this, but you always assume whenever people say mind's eye, they mean not your actual eye, but your kind of mind's eye.
Hmm.
And mind's eye is interesting because it's very tied to abstract reasoning, or at least in my case it is. I don't want to speak for other people's experiences, and I can totally see the apple. I know the test you're talking about, the apple.
Hmm.
I can totally see that on my mind's eye, totally fine. But comparing it to like trying to do the same in Kasina visualizations, it's interesting because then you actually do see the apple.
Yeah.
So a lot of it kind of leads me to wonder like what is mind's eye visualization? Is it actually visualization, or is it kind of recruiting the kind of thought patterns that you would have in your brain for whatever reason is good enough at making that kind of inference that it recruits all the thought patterns you would have as if you were to have seen this image, but you're not actually seeing it.
Hmm.
So it's kind of interesting to think about what is mind's eye visualization in regards to Casina visualization, and why did we evolve that versus like just actually Casina or something like that. But
Right.
yeah.
Cool. That's really fascinating. One thing I've been wanting to ask you is like, so is your advanced imagination ability limited just to visual stimuli, or can you also do this for sounds and I don't know, smells and touch?
No sounds, no smells. Touch is weird. I've been playing around with that some recently, more than the visualizations actually.
Mhm.
I can get every now and then. I can get if I'm playing around with the visualizations, and some for whatever reason, sometimes one will come directly into my eye. Like let's say it's a long vine or something like that, or it's like some kind of pointy object or something. For whatever reason, it goes exactly where I'm kind of imagining where my kind of eyes would be.
Okay.
For whatever reason, it does have some sort of tactile stimulation.
Hmm.
I'm not exactly sure how to describe it. It's very kind of diffuse. Very, it's not like a sharp point at all. There's some sort of. So I'm not sure if it's kind of like a mind's eye sort of thing where it is just kind
Hmm.
of the brain's reacting as if it expecting it, as if you would kind of like flinch away from something in the real world, or if it is actually the tactile stimulation being repurposed in the same way that my visual reification
Hmm.
or visual processing abilities are being. So I need to play around with that a little more. From the little bit I've researched on it from traditional practitioners, there's not a whole lot about tactile stimulation in particular. I've heard some people say that they've felt things, but not in any great detail. The one, it's kind of, and then you also have to kind of draw a line between tactile stimulation in the sense that all the things you're seeing tie directly into your tactile experience versus things like having jhana-ish feelings. Like for example, I feel like whenever I'm in kind of the strongest parts of these visualizations, I'm certainly in jhana 4, and it seems to be kind of touching on jhana 5 in the sense that I'm not dissolving my entire body yet. But there is this sense, especially when I'm looking at very abstract landscapes, very kind of spacey places, you kind of get this body feeling sense of being space almost. You get the sense that you're kind of constructing your perception of having a body, being bounded by a body.
Mhm.
But you also get the sense that this could be let go of. This is not a given. So there's interesting kind of like byproducts in the tactile sense that
Mhm.
aren't directly linked to what you're simulating, experiencing. And then of course with John 4, there's also just the great feelings of kind of peace and equanimity and all those kind of things.
Right, right.
So there's that. There's a lot of interesting kind of things going on there. And if you've ever read anything about neural annealing, from my kind of like felt kind of folk sense of what neural annealing feels like in me, from having done various psychedelics and having done meditation, that is definitely going on with Kasina as well. There's some sort of internal moving the furniture around kind of thing. That
Right.
was probably the best way I would describe it. So something's going on with that too, tactile. But again, it doesn't seem to be exactly tied to the images. But who knows? Maybe it's one of those things where, like, I've heard sometimes that, at least in terms of jhana meditation, or sometimes in trips that you see, in particular ayahuasca. Sometimes people hypothesize that your brain's showing you whatever your repressed traumatic whatever memory is,
Mhm.
but in a different form than what the actual memory is about, what the subjective content is about. Like, it's not showing you that content, but it's showing you some other kind of isomorphic equivalent representation. So you can deal with it, so you can process it, so you can kind of feel its energy, but also not be triggered by whatever the kind of traumatic, symbolic kind of baggage that is tied with the literal kind of one for one representation of what it is. So maybe that's going on too with the visualizations and the feelings.
Does
I
that
don't know.
mean does that mean you can like visualize an emotion and it has a imagistic quality to it
Mhm.
that okay.
No, it's not. It's not that particular synesthesia.
Yeah.
That would be cool. Maybe I should play around with that. One thing I will say is that sometimes colors can lead to temperature, which this is not. This is something I actually read about first before I tried it myself, and I ended up being to confirm it. But for example, if I do, I'm not sure exactly if it's tied to an emotion that allows me to trigger it. I'll have to pay attention closer next time. But for whatever reason, sometimes it seems to be more tied to intensity rather than, say, anger or something like that.
Mhm.
But if I can generate a red light or generate a lot of red shading, because in my case, usually I'm seeing my kind of primary color that I end up kind of everything kind of emerging from is this kind of dark blue black sort of thing. So usually it kind of feels like it's um, most things are kind of coming from that color, even if they change into different colors later. But if I kind of bathe the whole scene every now and then with this kind of red, my body temperature will rise like dramatically.
Mhm.
I'm usually laying down under a blanket or two. But if I do this, sometimes I have to like throw off the blankets during the middle of the meditation because I'm sweating so much.
Mm.
So it's interesting that you can kind of play around with that kind of visualization. So not emotion per se,
It's
but
something
you
more
can
physiological.
create. Temperature. You can mess around with body temperature, which again, this is something I read about first before I tried it myself.
Right.
So at least that seems to be a little more confirmed in terms of, and you can probably all find like a source to Sindel or something on that.
Cool.
But yeah,
Sounds like you have some pretty advanced Bene Gesserit powers, being able to control your temperature with nothing but your mere imagination.
yeah, exactly.
So do you use it for anything, or like like for therapeutic ends or something like that, or is it just for fun?
I mean, yeah, I guess you could say they're kind of one and the same for me.
Oh, okay.
But it does seem to be there is kind of something interesting going on. And again, it's like I said, it feels very tied to even if it's not traditional genre or the genre maps. It seems to be tied to some of whatever kind of neural annealing aspects that the genres have. Those kind of very kind of freeing, those kind of very relaxing aspects. So doing it very intensely for a couple hours, it feels great, and it has definitely helped me work through some stuff. And it's very interesting that usually the next day I'll have a lot more sensory clarity just in general as well.
Mhm.
More sensory clarity, and then also less, just kind of less in general, I guess, for lack of a better term, symbolic thought.
Mm.
I'm not one of those people whose like inner voice totally goes away.
Yeah.
But I can definitely notice that in addition to having a lot more sensory clarity, just the general kind of mental loops, in general kind of neuroticism goes way down. At least kind of an afterglow for the next day or two. So yeah, in the mental health regard, I think it would be a very interesting area to explore,
Mm.
especially if more people can get there with psychedelics, which again they seem to help. But I'm very hesitant to like recommend, oh, go try psychedelics, and this is like a shortcut because it doesn't feel quite like that. It feels like there is a lot more skill involved,
Yeah.
and that the
Absolutely.
psychedelics are like, or at least the little bit of ketamine I've tried. It's not that I mean I've never taken recreational doses of ketamine before, so I have no idea like if what I'm seeing is actually like a K hole or something like that. I have no idea. I have no reference kind of for that kind of set of visualizations. All I'm doing is making it because it seems to be very tied to muscle relaxation. I'm mostly using it for that because sometimes just knowing my body and having done a ton of yoga, I still have a lot of knots and a lot of tightness just kind of everywhere and a lot of tension.
Hmm.
They can be very difficult, even consciously after hours of body work, for me to let go of. So having that kind of has helped. But it would be interesting if to do more. Tie in. I've never seen any really, and it may be out there. I haven't really looked any kind of research that ties in Kasina meditation and those kind of visualizations to, for example, the visualizations you see on LSD. Because again, a lot of psychedelics seem to have different kinds or different phenomenon visually that they, whether it be in the subjective experience, in the content you're seeing,
Hmm.
or just if you've ever seen an article from Qualia Computing where they talk about here's how to write a rigorous report of a psychedelic trip. And they give you all these kind of like very kind of scientific research experimental kind of pathways to say, okay, no, if you're looking at alien like an alien in whatever you're if you I guess some people see aliens if they take like DMT or whatever. You're not actually that's your just kind of like what I'm saying with the casino visualizations. It's like that's your brain's, for whatever reason, your brain's visual reification, visual processing algorithms are just going on over time. So whatever you're seeing, you can consider it real, but you could also alternatively you could kind of do this kind of rational second on approach, where you say, okay, I'm going to look at how fast is this image pulsing? How am I seeing the shadows? How am I seeing trails is another one, because your visual kind of field has a sort of kind of intrinsic frame rate. That if things move too fast, that's when you see a blur versus being able to see something very clearly if it's moving slower. So how does that affect my kind of visual refresh rate? So they have all these kind of little hints and suggestions for breaking it down at kind of the kind of the level under content. Like what is generating this content? What in my kind of body perceptual experience could be creating that? So I have no idea if if anyone's done that comparing again say LSD or DMT visualizations to casino visualizations in terms of are they doing the same thing or are they doing something different? But that would be a very interesting pathway to research, I guess. Maybe I'll try it one day.
Cool. Gotcha. So, other than visualizations, how does this practice affect your sense of reality? You feel like, oh, this is something that causes you to like question certain fundamental assumptions you've had, or yeah, how does that factor in?
I wouldn't say it doesn't make me like question like, oh, we're living in a simulation. I would assume for some people it probably would, especially if you haven't had near as much research as I've had into just how perception works. Just
Hmm.
partially as part of my work as an artist and visual designer, and then also partially just from studying a lot of this kind of stuff. It probably the main thing is it reveals just how much your brain is constructing perception. Whenever you see the exact same shadows in Kasina that you're visualizing as you see in real life, you say, okay, it's you wonder how much. In one of my tweets, I think I mentioned something along the lines of your intuition for how much you're constructing versus how much you're perceiving. And our brains are very good, and studies have shown this long before anything on meditation or casino or anything. Has a lot of just kind of basic kind of research in the area of visual psychology and things like that have shown that we take in a very paltry amount of sense data, but our brains are just very good at. I wouldn't say deceiving us is the right word because it's it's a very helpful deception. It's
Hmm.
very good to be able to have all this data,
Constructing.
It's, so you don't want to use it kind of pejoratively in the sense that, oh, this is all an illusion. Like, no, it's not. It's, it correlates to the real world enough that it's a very helpful illusion.
Mhm. But
But
it's
in some sense,
constructed.
yes, it's
Yeah.
constructed. You can see, it's like, let's say maybe most people's intuition for, direct realism is the term that's thrown around a lot in this regard. How much of your experience is, totally real versus how much are you constructing it after the fact.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people, would say, oh, it's at least 50% real. It's, if not more.
Right.
Forgetting, there's a little weirdness on the edge of, like, optical illusions and things like that. So it's an edge case. Who cares? So that's, most people would, seem to buy into direct realism. But when you do things like Kasina and you realize you can kind of recreate the entire world,
Hmm.
based on just a little bit of the kind of stimuli you're seeing on your the back of your eyelids, it makes you wonder: is that about how much information I'm taking in terms of, like, photons from light, and then I'm just reconstructing all this world?
Hmm.
So, instead of your intuition being, oh, it's like 50 to 80% real world that I'm taking in, I'm only processing, like, maybe 20 or 30%. It's like, no, it's like, it feels kind of like there's like 1% stimuli, 99% construction now.
Oh.
Which again, it's like you don't want to go down the line of, like, oh, this isn't, that means everything's a simulation or things like that, or that means I'm hallucinating all the time. It's like, no, it's kind of a confusion of terms. If you frame it that way, it's just, you become more fascinated by how the world works, and that you would have thought, based on everything you would have never thought to, kind of step outside your own mind, in that regard, or realize that you're fabricating that much. And then it makes you wonder, what else can you fabricate for, your own benefit. So yeah.
Cool. So it just sounds like you're more aware than most people about how much of your vision is constructed, as in like 99% is construction and only 1% is just photons of light stimuli.
Yeah, I mean, and that's my estimate. That's just very impressionistic off the cuff. I have no idea if there's an actual stat or if that could even be measured.
But do you feel those numbers to be like roughly right for you? Like 1% to 99%?
Yeah, I would say somewhere between 1 to 5%. Just because knowing, if whenever you close your eyes initially, and whenever I start the meditation, there's nothing there. But
Mm.
then being able to reconstruct, basically the whole world.
Well, yeah.
You wonder, it's like, is this just me, recreating it versus usually I'm seeing it? Or am I, again, my argument would be, I'm using the same source, or I'm using the same processing,
Hmm.
that I would be using normally day to day. I'm just repurposing that, and just changing the 1% that is external stimuli,
Hmm.
from light photons to whatever I'm seeing on the back of my eyes. So that's kind of my thought experiment. That's kind of how it feels intuitively right now.
Yeah.
Again, I have no basis for any of that other than my intuition. But that's my sense.
Cool. Nice.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I think I've run out of any of questions now. Francis, do you want to like take over and uh,
Yeah, I just want to slightly loop back to this distinction between mind's eye, and I think, Jane, you're calling these powers you've gained in the last month or two hyperreal. Is that the word you've been using?
Yeah, once they get to the most kind of like the kind of strongest point, yeah, that's how I would kind of describe them. It's kind of like if you had a, it's kind of like modern CGI. I mean, it's just like, incredibly hyper realistic, to the point where, you really can't tell, and especially because it's happening in front of you in real time. Yeah, it's very, the only thing that, helps you to stay grounded is the fact that, like, it does, it kind of does have a, still, even though it's very hyper real, it does have a dreamlike quality, in the kind of sense
Mm.
of, it is, I'd be interested. I've never done a whole lot of lucid dreaming. I fall into them every now and then, but that's very rare.
mhm.
And I generally don't remember my dreams a whole lot. So I know I have them, and I know I wake up with them a lot, but I don't generally remember them, much longer past waking up with them. But I
So,
would assume that it's similar. It's all the same kind of visual processing, minutes.
mm.
Dreams are slightly different, because again, it's like, in this regard, I know exactly what I'm doing. But in dreams, it's like you never really notice, like, okay, where did that come from? Where did that come from? You're not paying attention to all the kind of like narrative, sequential logic of the dream, versus usually I can kind of pay attention
So,
to it.
in terms
So
of differences from like your normal day-to-day mind's eye, so it sounds like it's in your actual vision. Like your eyes are closed usually when you're doing this, but you're
mhm.
seeing it where you would normally see things. Like you start doing it
Yes.
by looking at the white noise in that you see with closed eyes.
Correct. Yeah, and then
Is
when I
that
open my
right?
eyes, I can kind of do the split screen effect, where it's like it's not. I can't make things 3D, like on a background of real life stuff. But I can kind of do this thing where I can kind of see the kind of, for lack of a better term, kind of like the murk, the kind of visual field that I see when my eyes are closed. If I'm looking at like a blank wall in a dark room or something like that. It is definitely the real visual perception, and it's not the mind's eye kind
Gotcha.
of like after image.
And in your mind's eye, you're a designer, so I'm assuming you get full quality, really
Huh.
realistic lighting and color and shading when you're
Oh
imagining
yeah,
things.
yeah. No,
Yeah, yeah.
I have a tweet somewhere where I talk about, oh yeah, I see the apple, and then I go on to write this like whole story about how I can visualize, like, oh, it's in this farm. It's like this American Gothic kind of setting, and like the wife watches what's the Chip and Joanna Gaines like decor show, like she watches that, and that's why her kitchen is decorated that the apple is in. That's why it's decorated like so. It's like
Wow.
there's the
But
whole red farm.
if you visualize that as hyperreal instead, would it be, in terms of the detail of what the
Mhm.
colors and textures are, would it be about as complex as the mind's eye one, just in your actual vision, or is there some other difference other than it being in your actual vision?
That's a very interesting question. I haven't really thought a whole lot about what my mind's eye visualization is in regards to Casina, because it seems like in both cases, but it's particularly in mind's eye now that I think about it, you wonder how much you're actually seeing, versus how much is your brain agreeing, okay, I am seeing this, if that makes sense.
Mm.
It's almost kind of like this subjective negotiation of, okay, I'm seeing enough of an apple to agree that I'm seeing enough of an apple, if that makes sense. And particularly, it feels that way in mind's eye because in Casina, that's not always the case. Casina is very
Mm.
more real. So there's this kind of sense that, and again, it's like I don't want that somewhat sometimes sounds pejorative in the sense of like, oh, I'm tricking myself, or oh, I'm like deceiving myself. It's like, no, that's as a designer, I can say firsthand, having a mind's eye visualization really helps. But at the same time, it's not quite the same thing as, oh, I'm actually perceiving all these kind of volumetric shadows, or I'm perceiving all those kind of things. If I thought about them, I could go to them. But I'm not getting them for free in the sense that when I imagine the apple, they're like all there, and it's not 100% there. It's like I have to consciously focus on, okay, now let me pay attention to the shadow aspect. So when I imagine the apple, like yes, I can see all the light and all the everything of that. But it
Mm.
doesn't. It still seems like it's 2% of the detail that would be there in real life, just because the nature of that kind of processing, the kind of more abstract serial processing that or the kind of abstract reasoning comes with, is very computationally intensive in the brain. Just like doing math in your head is very computationally intensive to do that kind of discrete step by step logic. So it seems like your brain's very good at saying we can take it wherever we want it. We can visualize whatever we want to visualize. But for the purpose of Imagine Apple, we can reach a very quick agreement on what that is. In terms of, okay, I can imagine the very tip of the apple, versus with Casina, it seems to be more of a, again, it seems to be more of a kind of parallel computing phenomenon, in the sense that, like, you see it all there, and it all happens kind of for free. You see, the shadows are just there. I don't have to imagine and say, it's kind of like when you think about, oh, I'm going to think about breathing. I'm going to consciously control my breathing. That's kind of the difference, I would say. Usually with Casina, it's like your breathing's running on autopilot. The visualizations are running on autopilot for it's, unless I kind of very slightly influence them. Versus with mind's eye, it's entirely that very very manual sense of I am controlling my in breath and out breath. If that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, that completely makes sense. Have you heard of the word prophantasia? So this is in the like aphantasia, hyperphantasia, hyperphantasia spectrum.
No, I have.
There's a guy called Aphantasia Meow who invented this word. It means in his definition projecting fantasia. So it's
Mhm,
getting imagined imagery into your actual vision.
mhm,
And the kind of I've heard of examples. I've got a friend who does this a bit, who talks about like seeing dragons come out of the pavement. When he was a child, he was very bored, and he would be imagining things a lot. And then eventually got to the point where he could see them in the real world. And similarly, I've heard of people like at high school make people they hated disappear, like invisible, like they became invisible, and things
mhm.
like that. So that feels like a kind of more similar to your hyperreal things, like dragging out into your actual vision and being a bit
Mhm.
more kind of altering the real world. Maybe, but maybe not, because you could do that in a less intense way, perhaps as well.
Mhm.
Do you experience anything like that? Where you've taken these hyperreal things and made them happen with your eyes open? Is that even useful or more
Um,
useful? How do you do that?
like I said, I can kind of manage the split screen thing, where I can kind of, again, if I have my eyes open and I have a blank enough surface somewhere in my visual field, it kind of acts like as if my eyes were closed, in the sense that the same visual snow or whatever can go on that surface, and it's not quite so busy. So it is essentially like, having a big blank surface is, equivalent in some ways to just having my eyes closed. It's anything for my kind of visual snow to kind of play on. Um, I would imagine, given that I can do that, I would imagine that there's not really any limit, and that past a certain point, you wouldn't need, your visual snow could get on, you could have it, interact on whatever background you want, or whatever, real life thing you want. I can do some kind of, talk about making someone disappear that you don't like. I can't do that, like constantly, as if like, okay, I erase them, they're gone, I never see them again. But like sometimes I'll be staring up at my bed at night at kind of the light fixture in my room, and usually it works better when the lights are off. But I can kind of sort of progressively kind of make it smaller or erase it. But it kind of feels like, it doesn't quite feel like the same thing casino wise, but maybe it is. But it just kind of feels like it kind of feels like you're just kind of stretching the noise you get already, which again, maybe that goes kind of against what I said earlier, which is like most of the noise you're getting is actually stuff you're constructing anyways. So I can do little effects like that, but not in the same way that it's like, oh, let me create a dragon right in front of me in real life. But again, it's
Yeah.
like I've heard of just within the narrow bounds of casino practice, I've heard of that being possible, or at least some of the original sources that kind of lay out the practice for this meditation, or at least formalized it in the canon, like say that kind of stuff is possible. So maybe again, clearly it's like maybe a month from now we'll be riding dragons everywhere in my real life. I don't know, but
Fantastic. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. It does feel like as a society, we've only just begun to explore how we learn to do these things better and the different kinds of them there are. It feels like there's a lot of work to do to unpick the different ways of learning it. Super interesting.
Fascinating. I feel like your Prophantasia, if we can even call it that, abilities far outstrip mine, a full range of imagination.
Mm. Thanks, Jane. That was fantastic.
yeah, thanks for having me.